Are we live?
Yes.
All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the ScoutLogic webinar on global background screening trends. My name is Dave Garcia, and I am the CEO of ScoutLogic. Joining me today is Andy Hellman, global background screening expert, who has graciously been leading us through our last two in these series in which we covered Asia Pac and EMEA. And today we are focusing on LATAM with three markets in particular: Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico. Like in our other sessions, Andy will go through some details on each, along with some general commentary on the region. This is an action-packed 30 minutes, so if you have questions, we may not be able to get to them at the end, but we will follow up with everyone with those questions as well. And we'll also be sending a recording of the webinar out to all registered attendees. And so with that, I will be quiet and turn it over to Andy.
Great. Thanks, David. And welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. If we can pull up the slides on the screen now, please. We're going to get started, and we're going to kind of go high level in today's discussion, where we're going to talk about, just why does Latin America matter to begin with, kind of set the stage for that. If we go to the next slide, please, Lay. And we're going to talk about some hiring trends, what kind of happens broadly in Latin America. And then you see we'll do deep dives into Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico. Those are a few of the more common countries that we'll see requested across Latin America. Then we're going to bring it back up to high level again, challenges across the region, best practices for dealing with those. And as David said, if we can get through this quickly, we might have time for a question or two, but if not, then you are welcome to send them in after today's webinar, and we'll be happy to get back to you via email with answers to your questions. So moving on to the next slide, why Latin America matters. A lot of you guys may know this already just from what you've seen in your own businesses, requests that you've gotten, but it's really a growing opportunity for global employers because it's got a large, highly educated workforce. We're seeing a lot of BPO growth across the region. Labor costs are fairly competitive. There's good talent there, Spanish and English speaking. Of course, remote hiring post-COVID always impacts things. And a lot of that somewhat is driven by, there was the offshoring trend, a lot of work going into India, Philippines, and other places in Asia. And then customers started to kind of go back to nearshore and bringing things closer to home, but still getting some of the benefits, some of the arbitrage by putting it into Latin American countries. And so that's all those kind of things drive more of a demand and more increase in screening across the region, even for CRAs in the US. However, this is a big however, of course, Latin America is not monolithic. Screening in Europe, like we talked about, GDPR is the law of the land. There's obviously local implementations of it, but give some consistency. Latin America really is country by country, and there's a lot more variation there from a legal and verification landscape. So a one-size-fits-all program just really is not the right way to go in Latin America. So something to take note as we go through these slides here. So moving to the next slide, regional regulatory landscape. The goals are always the same, right? When we're doing a background check, we're trying to make sure the person doesn't pose an undue risk to the company, to the employees, to safety, to brand, to money, any of those kind of things. But how we accomplish that from country to country can differ. And so while we have the same objectives, what can vary, privacy laws obviously vary from country to country. The second one here, this is big, criminal record access. We've already seen that in the other webinars we've done, and no less so in Latin America. Access to criminal record data can vary a lot from country to country, whether you can get it at all, how you get it, what you get back. Is it a single check or is it multiple checks and so on? ID verification across the region and how that's done, what government databases do and don't exist, what's needed to conduct a check can vary a lot. Is it just simple, some basic name and address information? Do we need forms and documents completed? How long it takes? And then lastly, looking at cross-border transfers, there are restrictions on data transfers, just like there are under GDPR in some of these countries. And so we want to say ultimately a successful background screening program really needs to balance all of this, the compliance, making sure obviously that we're complying with the law of the land, making sure there's a good candidate experience because some of these countries do require candidate involvement and that can make the experience a bit more challenging at times. We've got to have speed. We can't take weeks and weeks to get things done because the candidate may move on. And then, of course, accuracy. It underpins everything that we do in background screening. And so we're really looking to balance all that together as we look at these countries and what the restrictions are and how things are done. So if we move it on to the next slide, please. What can be verified? These are the things that we're commonly looking for. This doesn't say that every country, included in the three that we're going to deep dive into, that all these are available or all these are commonly run in every country for every background check. But these are the standard ones that we see across the globe. Criminal records is always one of the top ones that is requested, and always one of the top ones with the variability about what can or can't be done. Education and employment tends to be a little more consistent, as does identity. Those are kind of usually the four biggest ones that we'll see requests for. But then all the other ones as well, again, variation of what you can and can't get, whether it's appropriate to be used in all roles or not. Can the candidate or can you get the data on the candidate's behalf? Do they have to get it themselves? All those kind of things will vary as we'll see as we dive into the country by country look. So. All right, so let's get to the exciting part here as we move forward, the country deep dive. So you can see we're covering Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina. They span a range of privacy law and data availability. They span a few, both size-wise, biggest countries in Latin America, but also by volume, where we see a lot of requests coming from. And yeah, nicely top to bottom, north to south, they also span Latin America. So a really great subset to go with here. We're starting with Argentina. So Argentina, the law of the land is the Personal Data Protection Act. It was actually passed in 2000, so it preceded GDPR by not quite 2 decades. So it's been in force for quite a while, and privacy is a very entrenched concept in Argentina. There's been some talk about doing some reform to the law. Anything that old usually needs a little bit of rework, especially the way times have changed. But as of right now, this is still the law of the land. Under the PDPA, explicit consent is very important. So getting written authorization before you do data processing, very important to get that. And with all consent, we want to make sure that's a good, well-informed consent, not just like consent to a background check, but talking about the kind of data you're going to collect, what you're going to do with it, where the data might go, all those kind of things are good to put into a consent. Um, criminal records is a candidate-led process. Individuals must obtain and provide their own certificate. So I want to be really clear with this. This is not this is the easiest way to get it done, or it goes faster this way, but this is really a legal restriction. Third parties generally are not allowed to process or conduct criminal record checks, meaning that as CRAs, as background screening companies, we're generally not allowed to go get that record. The candidate has to do it, or their legal representative can do it to get that data and then provide it back to us. Very important to note that. And also, which is true a lot of places, but you'll see it even being more strict in terms of how it's applied. Relevance. Criminal record checks are only permissible when directly relevant to the role. And so you want to make sure that that relevance is very clearly documented and clearly defined. So not just it wouldn't be good if we have somebody with a criminal background working in this job. We need to say this specific offense relates to the role and these responsibilities or issues directly in this way. So make sure that you really can document that relevance. As we said, that candidate participation being necessary, it can make the process a little more complicated. And that goes back to that part about making sure that we've got a good candidate experience, being clear with the candidate about what they're doing, why they're doing, so that there's not confusion on their part. Um, so I think, Argentina can be a bit of a challenge in some ways, but Generally, we can get the data we need there as long as it's appropriate and valid if we follow the right steps and process. So let's move on to Brazil on the next slide, compare that to Argentina. So in Brazil, the law of the land is LGPD, the General Data Protection Law, and LGPD is just the Portuguese acronym for it, or the acronym of the law written in Portuguese, excuse me. It's similar to GDPR in some ways. It actually has 10 lawful bases for processing, similar to GDPR, consent, legitimate interest, legal obligation are available. And that's usually what we use in background screening. If you're using legitimate interest, just like under GDPR, make sure that you document a legitimate interest assessment to justify why you're running this background check and processing the data that you're processing as part of it. So you really need to make sure that you've got that because I wouldn't say it's your get out of jail free card, but it's if a regulator's come a knocking, that's something you want to be able to show to them to justify what processing you're doing. Um, One thing that's really important to call out in Brazil is the concept of sensitive data. So LGPD does have a definition of sensitive personal data similar to GDPR, but the list is around racial, ethnic origin, religious conviction, political opinion, union or religious, philosophical, political organization membership, health or sex life data, and genetic or biometric data. Criminal history is not included in that. And there is no separate, like in GDPR Article 10, there is no separate call out for criminal history. So criminal history under LGPD is not sensitive or special data in terms of how it's processing. That being said, it is still fairly restricted on processing criminal records in the standpoint that Brazilian labor law and Brazilian labor courts do or have opined that you can't just have a blanket criminal record requirement because that's discriminatory. So again, you've got to be able to show that the role is relevant. And generally, the categories where this is accepted, and you would need to consult attorney if you want to be really specific with roles, but generally speaking, domestic employees, caregivers of children or the elderly, caretakers of people with disabilities, some cases drivers, and positions like that, bank employees that are handling money, people involving weapons or controlled substances, those types of things. So it's a fairly constrained grouping there, but criminal record checks can be done, but you need to show direct relevance. And generally, it's kind of a limited list of roles where the labor courts have said that you can do that. So because it's the labor courts that are driving some of that, under a lot of countries or in a lot of countries, the privacy commissioner or privacy office may be driving the enforcement. In Brazil right now, it's still mainly labor courts and the labor prosecutor's office that are driving enforcement of these types of laws. The privacy regulator is increasingly becoming active, but hasn't totally gotten there yet. So, if you're looking into Brazil, don't just look directly at the privacy regulator, but also look a little more broadly at all the enforcement actions going on in terms of what's being done. And then lastly, a note, it's not directly on the slide here, but one of the things you want to pay attention to, most likely we'll be collecting is the CPF. It's a tax ID number. Don't ask me to say exactly what it stands for because I'll butcher my Portuguese. But it's in some ways kind of similar to a social security number, frequently used to do identification. So instead of like a date of birth or in addition to a date of birth or address, the CPF is also used as an identifier in Brazil. Okay, moving on. We are kind of flying through the region here. We're going to go to Mexico. So Mexico, it's a mouthful of a privacy law here. The LFPD-PPP is the privacy law. This was actually passed, I think, back in around 2010, but there was a major revision just done last year. And major enough, it's more or less essentially an all-new privacy law in Mexico. They dissolved the old Data Protection Authority. They changed, so now the data protection authority sits under the executive branch. Um, you still have things like ARCO rights under this. So ARCO, access, rectification, cancellation, opposition. So basically the right to dispute and get things corrected, access to your data. Privacy notice is still an important central piece of compliance. So a lot of stuff carried over, but there was a lot of new stuff in the law as well, kind of shifted to where the enforcement happens, where compliance is driven. Um, some of the things to note in Mexico that are a bit different, and I'm going to jump back to Brazil as part of this too. So in Mexico, there's no single criminal record database that an employer can query. Records actually get gathered from a number of different places, so they can sit at the state level, the state prosecutor's office. They can also be at the federal level. And this is similar to Brazil as well, where you've got the state level offenses and federal level offenses. And you can check just the state, you can check state and federal. So you want to pay attention to that when you're running criminal record checks in any of those countries. But what this means is that if you're running a check and you want kind of as broad a coverage as possible, it means you're searching multiple jurisdictions. And so that can drive turnaround time sometimes when conducting criminal record checks in Mexico. Criminal record checks in Mexico are probably a little more common than Argentina and Brazil. Not quite as strict in terms of making sure that you've got the relevancy to the role. So it can be a bit broader usage of them for more roles than you see in the other countries. Similar to we're talking about in Brazil, you've got ID numbers in Mexico as well, the CURP, or other official IDs that you gather to kind of be more precise about your matching. Because like a social security number, those are unique to the individual. Um, there is a couple of things to call out here with respect to Mexico. So there is a proposed reform to the labor law there that would potentially restrict employers from conducting criminal record checks. It's called the Carta de No Antecedentes Penales. So you wouldn't be able to run those for hiring purposes. Again, this is just a proposal. It's in process right now, unclear if it'll pass or not. So something just to be in the watch for, or be in the lookout for, of whether things may change with respect to conducting criminal record checks in Mexico. It may become just that they need to be more justified and they're not outright banned. So we'll try to keep you updated as the law changes there and update our documentation and information with respect to Mexico. Um, those are probably the big things from Mexico, looking at Mexico individually. And so we're going to kind of flip back now if we go to the next slide. So we talked about Argentina, Brazil, Mexico. All three have different privacy laws, different acceptance with respect to the use of criminal record information, how things are done. There are different restrictions on data transfers. So Argentina, for example, has more restrictive rules on data transfers out of the country, a little more similar to GDPR. But all that being said, there are a lot of things that are kind of more region-wide, regional pain points, regional commonalities, things like that, that are worth mentioning as well as we talk here. So looking at these, so candidate data, yeah, we frequently see missing candidate documentation being a problem. I think that's probably true globally, not just in Latin America. Incorrect personal information and name variations. This is one that's probably one of the more common things that we see in Latin America. And one of the main reasons for this is Spanish naming convention. So in the US, most typically, kids will get their last name, their surname from the father. Not 100%. We see hyphenations, combinations. It can be done all different ways, but most common is certainly father's last name. In Latin American naming convention, the full legal name is usually a combination of both the mother and the father's surname. So you get the primero apellido and a segundo apellido, the first and second last name, coming from the father and the mother. And so in everyday usage, someone might write just the paternal last name, more similar to what we see in the US. So just the father's last name, which might be like Garcia. Maybe the mother's last name is Hernandez. So the full legal last name would kind of end in Garcia Hernandez. In everyday usage, they probably would only write Garcia down. And so when you're collecting this name, you have to be clear that you need the full legal name, not just kind of the everyday usage name someone has. And to kind of complicate this as well, my understanding in Brazil, it's a similar concept, but they flip. And so first comes the mother's last name, then the father's. Don't quote me in that. That's kind of my understanding to put a little variation into it as well. So when you're collecting the names, you want the full legal name. You have to be careful and clear that you want both of the last names, which is pretty common to have. It's probably the single biggest issue in terms of not getting correct information across Latin America. Um, Looking at the verifications lag, so this thing's just taking time in the region. Things don't always go as fast. Things can be manual and paper-based, which always delays things. It's not always easy digitized information to look up. So that can drive turnaround times. Operational barriers, of course, again, nothing unique to Latin America, but language and dialects can cause challenges to getting things done. Delayed responses, whether it's an employer or a school or the applicant themselves responding slowly, all that can cause challenges. And lastly, like we talked about, there are data accessibility issues. We talked about three countries in specific, but there are a lot more than three countries in Latin America, obviously, and they all have their own variations, their own flavors of how things are done, how things get done, that can cause complications. Um, so, the key at the bottom, that last banner there at the bottom, most delays are preventable with strong preparation, integrated workflows. So, if you have things set up right, if you coach the candidates, they know you want the full legal name and not just kind of their everyday name. If you let them know about any documentation they might need to provide, all those kind of things, you can help prevent a lot of the issues. Never going to be 100%. There's always going to be delays, challenges, incorrect information, but prevention can go a long ways towards improving the process. So we talk about prevention. Let's move to the next slide. So it's really about best practices, right? And so we've come up with 5 tips to kind of help speed up the process across the region, across Latin America. So first, collect the complete candidate information up front. Going back for information after the fact, it's kind of a bad candidate experience, but it also adds a lot of turnaround time on as well. So, you want to make sure their name matches their government ID document, that you've got the full name, both first and second last name if they have them, that you're gathering other, like, the ID numbers, the CPF for Brazil or the CERT for Mexico. You're getting all this information up front that you need, and you're not going back a week after the fact saying, oh, yeah, we realize we need more information. Just it will slow things down, and it's not a good candidate experience. Make sure you get your consent up front, right? This should be kind of true across the board, but any authorizations and other privacy notices have to be done as well. Make sure all that's done at the outset. That you know everything you need to conduct all the different checks that are being ordered, and you get that up front. Can really help to make sure that supporting documentation is ready early. And so you can give candidates a heads up on that and say, hey, we're going to need, as part of your background check, a copy of this information, details of the address of where you worked, email or phone number, any of those kind of things. Just give them a heads up, because if any of you have been through a background check recently, trying to remember sometimes information from a decade ago or more. Some cases can be difficult. May take a little research on the candidates, and so giving them a heads up about that may let them be able to prepare some of this information in advance, and the way the clock kind of starts before they actually get the background check application. Keep the candidates engaged, let them know what's going on. If you need additional information, let them know. If they're going to have to participate in the process, such as in Argentina for a criminal record check, give them a heads up about that. Make sure the instructions are clear so there's not confusion. Can be really useful. And then lastly, partnering with local screening experts. I know that ScoutLogic's got a great group of in-country vendors that know the countries, that know the regulations, that know how to get things done, that speak the local language, can handle the dialects, all those other issues. So that's really important. I know that sometimes people say, "Oh, we'll just do it from the U.S. We can speak Spanish, or we can Google Translate or ChatGPT Translate now, as the case may be, and it's good enough." But the reality is having in-country expertise can really make the process go a lot better, a lot smooth, it's gonna be a lot faster, a lot smoother, and make sure that you're getting correct and accurate information as well. If anything comes back, having somebody that understands what is this record that got returned? Is this something I care about or not? Those kind of things are the critical benefit you get from having local screening experts. So I know we're getting close to the end of time here. Go one more slide here. So just some key takeaways to wrap this all up. Looking at the countries, some of the key things. Argentina, we talked about being candidate driven, candidate participation for the situations when you can run a criminal record check. So make sure that that process is well mapped out, well documented to make it easy and smooth for everybody. Brazil, we talked about the privacy law there, the LGPD, which is very similar in a lot of ways to GDPR. But unlike GDPR, where the privacy regulator maybe is the main enforcement mechanism, enforcement can come from multiple different governmental bodies. So you've got to be careful there. Capturing the CPF to make sure that you've got identity confirmed, an easier way to confirm identity. Mexico, being transparent about what you're doing, getting that consent up front, your privacy notices, making sure that you've got time allowed if you're doing criminal record checks because of the multiple different checks that get done there. All that can impact things. So, you know, looking big picture now across Latin America, like we said at the start, there's no one size fits all. Every country has some difference and variation to it. So you can't just say, here's the checks we're going to run. They're going to be the same everywhere. You really have to go country by country and understand what the requirements are and what you can and can't do. Kind of mapping that out ahead of time can help a lot, kind of auditing before the check, so to speak, and seeing what information is going to be needed, getting everybody prepared to gather that information or provide it. Um, Data cleanliness, really saying, let's make sure that we've got the right information up front. So if you're going to need that first and second last name, making sure it's really clear in the candidate instructions that you need both of those and not just their kind of everyday last name, so to speak. And then partnering for success, working with a company that knows what they're doing, has good in-country network of vendors there, can really help things go a little bit better, a little more optimized. So with that, I think we've got like maybe a minute left here. I'm not sure if that's really enough time for a question or not, or Dave, if you want to kind of defer people to mail their questions in and we can circle back after the fact.
Absolutely. So, Andy, thank you so much for such a rich amount of information on the region. As Andy said, we captured